Welcome to the community.
My name is April Brown. I am the co-director of the Langston Hughes Community Poetry Reading. And in other parts of community, people know me as a community organizer / activist. But I'd like to think of myself as just a real creative. Whenever I step into something, it's really important that I bring a creative process to that work so that people can get the most out of the work that they're trying to do.
My name is Kai Cameron, and I am the other co-director of the Langston Hughes Community Poetry Reading. We, 6 years ago, started working together on producing the annual Langston Hughes Community Poetry Reading. But in that journey, I found myself feeling and actually producing, working, and demonstrating myself as I think the hidden artist within. I've done much more writing, starting to write poetry, and being really involved with other artists in this really vibrant Providence community. So it's been a very exciting journey so far.
The Langston Hughes Community Poetry Reading it's a program that was developed by Ann Edmonds Clanton, who was the executive director of the Langston Hughes Center for Arts and Education. And she used to do these really great community events. I was at an event, and Kai has always been really fly. And you know when you're a little girl and you're looking at people to kind of see how you form your own style? And Kai is one of about 5 women who I remember you'd look at and be like, that's what I want to do. I want to look like that when I get big. One of the things about the center was there was this kind of underlying current for jazz. And so my family would go to the Newport Jazz Festival every year. And that's actually how Kai and her husband Stan and I got to develop in terms of relationship. Yeah, because with Langston Hughes, you always kind of have to bring that whole jazz kind of ideology with you because it's a part of the work.
We really kind of solidified our relationship. There is a generation gap that I work very hard to narrow. Very hard. But, you know, as I said, in the last few years, we've become, I feel, very close, you know, with regards to not only the work that we share, you know, the feelings, the ideas, the people that we know. She has been an excellent supporter, and maybe she doesn't consider herself, but I look at her as a mentor, you know, because what she's exposed me to is a completely different arena. It's a different view of community.
So tell me a little bit about the work that you do through the Langston Hughes Foundation.
So we inherited the poetry reading 6 years ago. When you said 6, I was like, oh my God. So 6 years ago, and like I said, Ann Edmonds Clanton was the person who was producing it, and she said, you know, the last time she did it was, April, it's yours. And I thought, wow, I got an inheritance. I didn't even know that I needed an inheritance. One of the things that was also troubling is that we got this inheritance, but it wasn't like it was funded. So we had to fundraise, you know? So Kai and I would talk about how we want to give the community poetry reading back to the community. Because in that first year we did it, we just basically repeated what Ann had done, that formula. And what we found is there weren't a lot of variations in terms of who was reading, who knew about it. And that troubled me because it's not just about people reading a poem. For us, it was really about people understanding who Langston Hughes is. Langston Hughes, for all intents and purposes, on this side of the water, he's our Shakespeare. He was so prolific. And he talks about all of the experiences of what it means to be Black. He talks about what it's like to be a Black person in Europe. He talks about what it means to be a poor person in Europe. And those kinds of perspectives are important for us to understand each other. Langston Hughes was a war correspondent in Spain, in Paris. And so he's making political commentary about Russia, about Japan, about the West Indies. And the fact that it's put in simple language so that the garbage man can read it, that is kind of the impetus for us about the poetry reading. It cannot be exclusive. It has to be open. And he was too important to kind of be forgotten on the shelf, right? And also what's really exciting is just what Langston Hughes does to people, right? His words, people critiqued him so much about his words being simplistic, but people understood what he was saying. There was never any confusion about what he was trying to get at, what he was trying to say. And that's important because it's access, right? It's about access. So, but from there, we were able to hire a poet in residence to talk to young people about who Langston Hughes was, the characters in his writing, and then get them to write poetry about what were their experiences, what were they living through, what did they see on an everyday basis. And so it feels like now when we talk about the poetry reading, it's a much broader thing than just this event that happens the first weekend in February.
So for me, I've always wanted to be able to articulate what community is, what family is, what interconnection is between people, how different people relate to each other regardless of their culture. So it kind of gave me a little boost or support to not be afraid to express that in different ways.
When we talk about the community in our poetry reading, we're talking about the folks who don't have access oftentimes, or the people who you don't see all the time. For me, it's everyone. If community isn't everyone, then it's actually not community. It's something else. When I was at the Smithsonian, a lot of my work was working with young people, right? But it was also trying to help people understand that the artistry that is seen as such a singular thing for the artist actually exists in all of us, right? And I think I talk about that when I'm with children, and children will say, well, middle school kids, right, will say, oh, I can't draw, I'm not an artist. But little kids, you're an artist, okay. And they have the freedom to sing, dance, paint, whatever, because they understand that that's actually an expression that's inside of them. And I think it's that, being able to bring that ideal, that idea to every part of the human expression. I mean, I feel like we might have even talked about this too, that the arts practice is what keeps us human. It's this spiritual engagement into something that we cannot see. When I think about what community is, it has to be engagement that brings us together. If it is not that, then it's not community. It's just not.
We've really been able to just kind of bury in, dig down into the fact that we want to bring everybody in, and we've been able to, in my mind, been able to anchor it, with the inclusion of young people.
There was this thing where, like, we had a janitor read, and he's an artist, and he brings me his painting, and he says, see, I'm an artist. And I was like, oh my God, well, what's your favorite poem? And he says, I love Langston Hughes. I said, well, what's your favorite poem? He can't tell. I said, well, I have a poem. And I mean, there are pictures of him, and he's just doing all of this, performing like a Sunday school kid in church. And I was like, okay. Do you know what I mean? So it's that. And no one's asking the janitor to come to a poetry reading, right? But yet, that's the thing. Or the little shy little boy who is sitting in the corner in school, who is kind of like thrown away, and then we say, read this poem about death. He kills it. And we're like, okay, see, we have to talk about the last year poetry reading in community. We partnered with the House of Glitter, and that was both wonderful and horrible at the same time because it was COVID, right? And, you know, I remember being away in Ghana and Matt Garza saying to me, April, I know that you don't want to engage in this idea that we're going to be in person, but we're not going to be in person. And I was in such deep denial. And then when I came back, I was right on board. But working with them was so much fun. And yet it was really hard because it was totally virtual, which is something I think will probably have to be a part of the poetry reading. But I really never want to do another virtual event again. It was difficult. But at the same time, what was wonderful, we had people from Puerto Rico, we had people from Israel, South Africa. We were able to get such a breadth and depth of community in that experience that what I remember thinking is, we're getting it. We're closing in on what community is supposed to be. We're closing in on how community is big. This idea of, we had different languages spoken in that poetry reading. We had Spanish, we had Arabic, we had Bengali, we had Haitian Creole. I mean, just all of these ways that we were able to interact. And it was about Langston Hughes, right? It was all his work. It was all about this idea of, oh my God, this poem, I love this poem. Well, why don't you recite that poem in your language? Bring me all your dreams, you dreamers. Bring me all your heart melodies, that I may wrap them up in a blue cloud cloth, away from the too rough fingers of the world. I feel like we need to find younger people who are interested in the same kind of, what I call this vibration, right? Because I don't get here to do what I do without a George Houston Bass, without a Ramona Bass, without a Rob Dimmick, without these people who were in community doing this work, right? And it's an inheritance, right? This is not something that you do because it's yours or you want to do your own thing. You do it because you care so much about the culture. And the culture, again, is big, right? So what we are in the process is trying to identify someone who can carry it on and raise enough money so that the person can actually do it and it be a job, right? And their job is to make sure that they're keeping the culture, right? And it has to be intergenerational. And it has to be, you know, all the genders, all the classes, all the sex, all of it, right? Because that's who we are as human beings, right? That's what the future looks like, right? I mean, in a couple of years, we'll be celebrating the 30th anniversary. Can you imagine that the community, Langston Hughes Community Poetry Reading will have been going on for 30 years? And it's important because there is this erosion of this kind of vibration, right? As we think about this small little place in Providence that is the creative capital, but before it was ever named the creative capital, there was creativity happening. And before there was a RISD, and before there were any of the other arts organizations that are here, there were people who were creating. And I feel like we are the organization who sees that, recognizes that, and says, come, what you got? What I would like to ask Langston, were he still alive, is what is the thing that you wished you could have written? When he dies, the civil rights movement is happening, right? And so in his mind, the world is maybe beginning to pivot. Do you know what I'm saying? And here we are 50 some odd years later, and it's like we pivoted back. And so I wonder what he would have written about to give us, to say, okay, here we are now. What would you say to us now? Because a lot of the things that he has written in the past is so resonant now.
I would like to ask him, so who or what inspired you to step out in the world? Who inspired you to leave Joplin, Missouri, or wherever he was living with his mother, grandmother, and family members, that gave you the courage and the inspiration to take on the world, to step out in the world?
This book was given to me by a gentleman who owns a brewery in Newport. And I'm so mad that I messed up the cover. So this book has become the Dreamkeeper, the Dreamkeeper.
Yeah.
It is, and there's his signature.
All right.
Wait, is that?
Yes, yes,
Wow.
yes.
Yeah.
Yay!
Yeah, let me,
Wow.
But it's so important that you see that it's signature.
Yes.
So it's the opening of a brewery. The brewery is going to name a beer after some idea of blackness, right? As a way to show allyship. So they call it Sankofa Connection. Nico Merritt calls me up and says, April, can you come and do some poetry? I said, what? And it didn't make sense. None of it made sense. And so I come to this brewery in Newport. This guy who I do not know, I want to give you this book. I said, what? And I opened the book, and I'm like, I remember having this book as a little girl. Of course it makes sense, right? Because, again, community is big.
Well, thank you so much for sharing time, for sharing your stories with us today. I appreciate it so much.
Oh,
Thank
you are
so
more than
much.
welcome. Yes, for even thinking of us.
This was so much fun.